What concerns does Jane Austen raise about her world, and how does the novel answer those concerns? Why, for example, are all the pairings at the end of the book ultimately rather predictable? In what ways does the novel Emma reveal skepticism? How is it a book appropriate for its time, considering its historical context? Jane Austen was born in 1775, a time period where women were restrained by the societal expectations to marry within their social class and provide domestic comfort. Jane Austen's criticism of this is shown through many of her novels, including her 1916 novel, Emma, that revolves around marriage plots.
We see Jane Austen raise concerns about following marriage constraints from the beginning of the novel, when Emma assumes the role of being the Highbury matchmaker. Emma attempts to pair Harriet up with Mr. Elton, who is of high class, despite the fact that Harriet's parentage and therefore social status is unknown. Mr. Knightley calls this into question on page 75, when he tells Emma, "Men of family would not be very fond of connecting themselves with a girl of such obscurity, and most prudent men would be afraid of the inconvenience and disgrace they might be involved in when the mystery of her parentage came to be revealed. Let her marry Robert Marden, and she is safe, respectable, and happy forever."
Her answer, didn't you? If I did, I would have done no wrong. He is not Harriet's equal. I agree, he is not her equal. Good. He is her superior in sense and situation. What are Harriet Smith's claims of birth or education that make her higher than Robert Martin? She is the natural daughter of nobody knows whom. The advantage of the match was entirely on her side. What? A farmer? Even with all his merit, a match for my dear friend. It would be a degradation for her to marry a person whom I could not admit as my own acquaintance. A degradation? For illegitimacy and ignorance to marry to a respected, intelligent farmer? She is a gentleman's daughter.
This passage demonstrates how the higher class is skeptical of the lower class, and therefore crossing societal boundaries, especially those pertaining to marriage, is seen as risky and inconvenient. Jane Austen implies that as humans, we are skeptical of what we don't know, of what we aren't familiar with. We create class divisions because we can relate best to people with similar lives to ours, which all comes back to only associating with others that are of similar wealth and family background. Since Emma believes Harriet might be of higher class, she refuses to let Harriet cross class boundaries by marrying Mr. Marden at first. However, Mr. Knightley, our normative voice, foreshadows that Harriet will not marry Mr. Elton because she's a lower class. She will marry Mr. Marden because he is most relatable to her background. Therefore, Jane Austen opens the possibility of breaking societal rules, but conforms to them in the end. Jane Austen upholds societal standards
of marriage at the end of the novel when the pairs are matched within their respectable classes. There could have been different factors that went into this decision, such as the influence of the French Revolution. The French Revolution occurred as Jane Austen was growing up. She was aware of the horrors and chaos resulting from the Revolution, which was just across the English Channel. This attempt to discard societal rules and structures may have frightened Austen, causing her to match the pairs as she did. Perhaps Austen wanted progress, but she realized that crossing societal lines would only bring disruption and despair. This is shown through Mr. Weston's marriage with his first wife. Austen wrote on page 35, "Miss Churchill was not to be dissuaded from the marriage, and it took place to the infinite mortification of Mr. and Mrs. Churchill, who threw her off with due decorum. It was an unsuitable connection and did not produce much happiness." Miss Churchill's marriage with Mr. Weston caused her to be shunned by her family and unhappy. Austen knew that a marriage into a different class would be chaotic, which was frightening.
Jane Austen had Emma's ideal pairings fail in this novel because Austen saw that her society wasn't ready for a new progressive form of marriage. The same could be said of education in Austen's time and in the book Emma. Most women in Emma and Austen's society were educated in art, music, and romantic novels, mostly just to be able to hold a conversation during social gatherings. Jane Austen recognized this and attempted to challenge this idea throughout the novel. Jane Fairfax, in comparison to Emma, represents the ideal woman versus the unideal woman. Fairfax is not only educated in music, art, and in romantic novels, but she excels in them, not questioning the route she is taking, unlike Emma, who always jumps around and never finishes anything completely. Like Mr. Knightley stated, Emma has been meaning to read more ever since she was 12 years old. I have seen a great many lists of her drawing up at various times of books that she meant to read regularly through, and every good list they were very well chosen and very neatly arranged, sometimes alphabetically and sometimes by some other rule, but I have done with expecting any course of steady reading from Emma. She will never submit to anything requiring industry and patience, and a subjection of the fancy to the understanding. This demonstrates that Emma differs from the conventional woman in Austen's time, which follows society's educational standards. Emma has been able to form her own opinion on her world by not focusing on these standards.
Strengthen the female mind by enlarging it, and there will be an end to blind obedience. Mary Wollstonecraft's ideology is present in Austen's works, particularly Emma, and it's seen through the contrast of conventional female characters, who are quite dependent on their male counterparts, such as Isabella, and more independent characters in terms of thought, such as Emma. Austen mentions how Isabella is quite reliant on her husband, as women were during Austen's time period. Isabella didn't question her husband's authority and could not identify the insults he made towards her, as mentioned on page 99. He was not an ill-tempered man, not so often unreasonably cross as to deserve such a reproach. But his temper was not his great perfection, and indeed, with such a worshipping wife, it was hardly possible that any natural defects in it should not be increased. The extreme sweetness of her temper must hurt his. He had all the clearness and quickness of mind which she wanted, and he could sometimes act an ungracious or say a severe thing. He was not a great favorite with his fair sister-in-law. Nothing wrong in him escaped her. She was quick in feeling the little injuries to Isabella, which Isabella never felt herself. In contrast to Isabella, Emma doesn't rely on a man to tell her how or what to think, but rather she accepts the criticism of a man she deems her superior, or at least her equal, Mr. Knightley. Mr. Knightley's criticism of Emma's behavior guides Emma rather than replacing Emma's own thoughts. This demonstrates how a greater education, such as the one adopted by Emma, makes the difference in the ability for women to think for themselves, and to put an end to the blind obedience Wollstonecraft frowned upon.